18 days, $2 million. Three of the most credentialed engineering teams in the aviation industry, and not one of them could figure out why a $400 million aircraft refused to leave the ground. The contract was hours from collapse. The company was bleeding out in slow motion, and the only person in that hangar who actually understood what was wrong was the man nobody had bothered to learn the name of. He wore a maintenance uniform. He clocked in at midnight. He ate lunch alone. And he was about to save everything. If stories like this are what you came here for, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Every comment, every like, it tells me you're out there and it keeps these stories coming. Don't go anywhere. This one is just getting started. The hangar at Hartwell Aviation's primary facility had a particular smell in the early morning hours. Jet fuel and cold metal, and the faint chemical bite of hydraulic fluid that never quite left the air, no matter how many times the ventilation system cycled through. Mason Reed had worked inside that smell for going on 3 years. It had soaked into his jacket, his hair, probably his skin by now. He didn't notice it anymore. That was the thing about spending enough time in a place. It stopped registering as anything unusual and just became the texture of your days. What Mason noticed that Tuesday morning, the 18th morning of what the day shift supervisors had taken to calling the apex situation, was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. The Apex X900 sat at the center of the hangar the way a patient sits in a hospital bed, surrounded by people, connected to machines, and utterly unable to do the one thing it was built to do. The aircraft was extraordinary by any reasonable measure. Hartwell's engineers had spent 6 years designing it. The fuselage lines were cleaner than anything currently flying commercial routes. The avionics suite was the most integrated system the company had ever produced, and the engines felt 2 Meridian RT-7 turbofans capable of pushing the aircraft to Mach 0.92 were supposed to represent the next generation of efficient, reliable power. Supposed to. The right engine kept shutting itself down. That was the short version. The longer version involved 3 separate engineering teams, 14 different diagnostic approaches, a full engine swap that solved nothing, and a number that had been circling through the executive hallways for days now, $2,300,000. That was what 18 days of specialist consultants, replacement parts, and overtime labor had cost so far, and the aircraft still hadn't moved. Mason was pushing a parts cart along the eastern wall of the hangar when he heard the voices rise again from around the X900's starboard side. He didn't slow down. He had learned early on that the fastest way to get asked to leave an area was to look like you were trying to listen to something. The sensor array on the FADEC input is reading phantom data. That was Dr. Philip Crane, the lead diagnostics consultant Hartwell had flown in from Seattle 11 days ago. He had a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who had never once been wrong in front of a room full of people and intended to keep that record intact. We pull the entire module, run a clean bench test, reinstall with a fresh calibration baseline. We already replaced the FADEC module. This was Connor Hayes, Hartwell's senior systems engineer, a man in his mid-40s who had not slept a full night in 2 weeks and whose patience had eroded to something close to the bone. Day 9. Didn't change anything. The replacement unit may have been introduced with the same corrupted baseline. That's not how factory-fresh modules work, Philip. I'm telling you what the data shows. The data has shown us 17 different things in 17 days. At some point, we have to acknowledge that maybe we're looking at the data wrong. Mason stopped his cart near a tool bench about 40 feet from the conversation, pretending to inventory a row of inspection probes. He wasn't pretending very hard. Nobody was looking at him. What he was actually looking at was the aircraft, not the readouts, not the diagnostic terminals that had been set up along the left side of the hangar, their screens full of trend data and fault trees and parameter logs. Mason was looking at the physical airplane, the way it sat, the way the engine cowling on the right side had been opened and opened again so many times over the past 2.5 weeks that the hinge pins were starting to show wear marks. The way the ground crew had positioned the ground power unit slightly differently than standard procedure allowed, probably because the standard position was now occupied by one of Crane's diagnostic rigs. He had a theory. He'd had it for about 6 days. The problem was, Mason Reed was a night shift maintenance worker, not an engineer, not a consultant, not a member of any of the 3 teams currently billing Hartwell 6 figures a week to stand around arguing about sensor arrays. He was the guy who pushed the cart. Evelyn Hart arrived at the hangar at 7:15 that morning, which was 45 minutes earlier than her assistant had scheduled, and roughly 2 hours earlier than most CEOs of companies like Hartwell would have bothered to show up. She had been arriving early every day for the past week. The board had stopped pretending they weren't tracking her calendar. She was 53 years old and had spent the better part of 20 years rebuilding Hartwell Aviation from a mid-tier regional maintenance contractor into a genuine aircraft development company. The X900 program was supposed to be the proof. 12 years of incremental work, patient capital, and a workforce she had assembled almost person by person. And it had led here, to this contract, to this aircraft, to this hangar where 3 teams of experts had spent $2 million not fixing a problem that was going to cost the company everything if it wasn't resolved in the next 36 hours. The Meridian Group's demonstration window closed Friday at noon. After that, their procurement committee moved on. The contract, $1.2 billion over 7 years, went back into consideration, and Hartwell went back to being a company with a promising prototype and no future. Evelyn had not told anyone that she had already spoken to 2 different restructuring consultants last week. She wasn't going to tell anyone. But she had. She walked the length of the hangar with her operations director, Adrian Blake, half a step behind her and slightly to her left, which was where he always positioned himself. Adrian was meticulous about positioning. He was meticulous about most things. He had been with Hartwell for 4 years, had managed the operational side of the X900 program for 2, and had a particular talent for summarizing complex situations in ways that made it sound like he already knew the solution and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Crane still thinks it's the FADEC input, Adrian said. Crane has thought it was 17 different things. Hayes is pushing for another full harness inspection, which would take 3 days minimum. I know. Evelyn stopped walking. She was looking at the aircraft. Where are we actually? Adrian was quiet for a moment, the practiced quiet of someone organizing information. Honestly, we're in the same position we were 4 days ago. The fault presents identically every time. Right engine FADEC receives an input signal that doesn't correspond to any actual system condition, interprets it as a critical parameter exceedance, initiates protective shutdown. The engine itself checks out clean every single time we bench test the components. Whatever is triggering the fault isn't showing up when you pull the parts and look at them separately. So the engine isn't broken. Correct. Something is making the engine think it's broken. That's the working theory, yes. And in 18 days, nobody has figured out what. Adrian didn't answer that one. Evelyn turned away from the aircraft and looked at the diagnostic terminals, then at the cluster of engineers near the engine cowling, then at the length of the hangar, the carts and the tool benches and the workers moving through the peripheral space while the specialists occupied the center. Her eyes moved the way a person's eyes move when they're searching for something they can't quite name. "What's the name of the night crew lead?" she asked. "Martinez, Jorge Martinez." "Not him, the other one, the one who's been here every morning when I arrive." Adrian's expression shifted slightly. Not much, just a tightening at the corners. "I'd have to check the roster." "He's over there," Evelyn said. "By the tool bench." Mason became aware that the CEO was walking toward him at approximately the same moment he became aware that he had no reasonable explanation for what he was doing standing at a tool bench 40 feet from the diagnostic area, staring at the underside of an aircraft engine for the past 10 minutes. He straightened up, started actually counting the inspection probes. "Good morning," Evelyn Hart said. Mason turned. She was closer than he expected. "Morning. You've been watching the aircraft." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact delivered by someone who was tired of receiving incomplete information and had apparently decided to collect some on her own. Habit, I guess, Mason said. What's your name? Mason Reed, night shift. Evelyn nodded slowly. She looked at the aircraft, then back at him. What do you see when you watch it? It was a strange question. The kind of question that could mean nothing or could mean something, and Mason had learned a long time ago to be careful about which one he assumed. He had a wife who used to tell him that he was incapable of reading a room, which was mostly accurate, but she also used to say that his inability to read a room sometimes made him the only person willing to say the thing the room needed to hear. She had been gone for 2 years now. He still thought about what she said. I see a fault pattern, Mason said. Evelyn was quiet. Every time the engine shuts down, he continued, and he was aware that he was walking a narrow ledge here, that the right person overhearing this conversation could make the next week of his life considerably more difficult. The warning sequence is wrong. Wrong how? The order. FADEC faults don't present that way. Normally you get a sensor deviation reading first. The system catches a parameter going out of range before it trips the shutdown. But on the X900 failures, the shutdown warning comes almost simultaneous with the sensor deviation, or sometimes slightly before. He paused. That's not how the system reads a real fault. That's how it reads if someone fed the system a preformed signal. Evelyn Hart looked at him for a long moment. You're a night shift maintenance worker. Yes, ma'am. Where did you learn avionics fault analysis? Mason picked up one of the inspection probes and turned it over in his hands. I worked in aircraft reliability engineering for about 11 years, before I came here. What happened? He didn't answer that. She didn't push it. People who had seen enough of life learned quickly which questions were going to be answered and which ones weren't. You think someone deliberately created the signal, Evelyn said. I think it's worth looking in the right place, which nobody has been. And where's the right place? Physically between the engine control module and the aircraft wiring harness, not at either end, in between. She studied him for another moment. Then she turned and looked at the cluster of engineers around the starboard engine, Crane still talking, Hayes still arguing, 2 junior engineers looking at screens and saying nothing, because they had learned that the way to survive this kind of meeting was to look busy and keep your head down. Come with me, Evelyn said. The silence that descended on the group around the Apex X900 when Evelyn Hart arrived with a maintenance worker in tow was the particular silence of people who had very strong opinions about hierarchy and were trying not to express them immediately. Dr. Philip Crane managed it for about 4 seconds. Ms. Hart, we were just discussing the next phase of... Give us a minute, Philip. She didn't look at Crane. She was looking at the engine cowling. Mason, show Dr. Crane and Mr. Hayes what you were telling me. Mason was aware of eyes on him. He was aware of the exact quality of the attention, the diagnostic attention of experts who were waiting for a layperson to say something technically incorrect so they could explain why. He had felt that attention before, in a different hangar, a different life. The failure sequence, he said, every recorded instance. Can someone pull the last 6 shutdowns up on the terminal? Connor Hayes looked at Evelyn. Evelyn said nothing. Hayes turned to one of the junior engineers and nodded. The fault logs came up on the nearest screen. 6 shutdown events, each one time-stamped, each one showing the cascade of warning flags that had preceded the engine protection system's decision to shut down. Mason stepped to the screen. He pointed at the timestamp columns. Look at the delta between the sensor deviation alert and the shutdown command. In a real FADEC fault response, that delta is never less than 340 milliseconds. The system is designed that way. It gives itself a window to confirm the reading before acting. Crane crossed his arms. We're aware of the design parameters. Then you know what this means. Mason pointed to the first logged shutdown. The delta was 40 milliseconds. He moved to the second. 38 milliseconds. Third, 41. The system didn't have time to confirm anything. It received a signal that was already in shutdown command form and processed it. That's not how a real fault generates. That's how an injected signal looks. The silence after that was different from the earlier silence. Hayes leaned toward the screen. He pulled up the 6 shutdown event himself and looked at the delta. Then he looked at Crane. Crane's arms were still crossed, but something in his posture had changed. "Even if you're right about the signal characteristics," he said, and the slightly conciliatory shift in his tone was the closest thing to a concession Mason was probably going to get from him. "That doesn't tell us where the injection point is." "No," Mason agreed, "but it tells us where to look." He turned toward the aircraft. "The injection point has to be somewhere the signal can enter the system after the sensor, but before the FADEC processor, physically, not electronically. Somewhere you can introduce a resistive condition that mimics a fault state without showing up on bench tests of individual components." "You're describing a passive interference element," Hayes said slowly. "I am. In the wiring harness, or at the connection point between the harness and the engine control module. Somewhere that's been overlooked because everybody's been focused on the electronic systems, not the physical installation." Hayes turned to Evelyn. She had been watching this exchange with the focused expression of someone who was very good at letting people reveal themselves and had decided to let this one run. "Give him access," she said. Crane started to say something. She looked at him. He stopped. Mason spent 12 minutes under the engine. He had borrowed a pen light from a tool bench because the hangar lighting at the underside angle wasn't sufficient. He moved methodically, not rushing, checking connection points the way you check connection points when you've learned that the smallest things make the biggest differences, by feel as much as by sight, running his fingertips along the harness junctions and the module mounting points, and the places where components were bolted together rather than integrated. He found it between the engine control module's lower mounting bracket and the aircraft's primary wiring harness junction. A washer. Small, polymer, off-white. The kind of shim isolation component you might find in a dozen legitimate applications throughout an aircraft's electrical system. This particular washer was positioned to create a controlled resistance at the ground connection for the FADEC sensor input circuit. Not enough to disrupt normal operation. Enough under specific load conditions that matched the X900's engine startup sequence, to generate a transient voltage spike that the FADEC interpreted as a fault signal. It would not have shown up on bench tests. The resistance was too subtle. It would not have been visible on diagnostic screens. It was physical, not electronic. It would have been missed by every team that focused on the data instead of the machine. Mason lay on his back under the engine for a moment before he said anything. He looked at the washer. He looked at how it was positioned. He thought about the fact that it was positioned correctly, not accidentally, not sloppily. Whoever had placed it understood exactly what they were doing. He thought about that for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he reached up and removed it. The Apex X900's right engine started on the first attempt. The sound it made, the ignition sequence cycling up clean and steady, the turbine spooling without hesitation, the RPMs climbing through the normal progression without a single warning flag, was the sound of something working the way it was supposed to work. After 18 days, it hit the ear differently than a normal engine sound would. Several of the engineers stood absolutely still for a moment, like they couldn't quite process what they were hearing. Connor Hayes had his hand pressed flat on the engine cowling, feeling the vibration. He looked at Mason with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite embarrassment, and was probably some honest mixture of both. Crane said nothing. He walked to the nearest diagnostic terminal and looked at the parameters. Clean, every line clean. Evelyn Hart was standing back from the group when Mason came out from under the engine. She was watching the aircraft with the expression of someone who had just been given very good news that had arrived wrapped around very bad news, because she understood, the same moment Mason did, what the washer meant. The aircraft hadn't malfunctioned. The aircraft had been sabotaged. Mason held the small polymer washer in his palm. He looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. Around them, the hangar filled with the sound of the engine. Steady, powerful, perfect. And nobody was celebrating, because the question that had replaced 18 days of technical confusion was already sitting in the room with all of them, and nobody wanted to say it first. Someone in this building had done this. Someone who knew exactly how to do it, who had access to the aircraft, and who had done it well enough that it had taken 18 days and $2 million before anyone found it. Mason closed his fingers around the washer. He already had a feeling it wasn't going to be the last thing he found. The washer sat on Evelyn Hart's desk by 9 o'clock that morning, sealed inside a clear evidence bag that Mason had asked one of the hangar techs to find. It looked ridiculous. A small, off-white polymer disc, barely the diameter of a shirt button, occupying the center of a mahogany desk that probably cost more than Mason's monthly salary. But Evelyn hadn't moved it. She kept looking at it the way you look at something that has reordered your understanding of a situation you thought you already understood. Mason sat across from her in a chair that was too comfortable for the kind of conversation they were having. Adrian Blake stood near the window with his arms folded, which was apparently his default posture when he didn't want to be the one talking. "Walk me through it again," Evelyn said. "Slowly. The washer creates a resistive ground fault at the FADEC sensor input junction," Mason said. "Not constant, conditional. It only generates the fault signal when the engine's in a specific load condition during startup. Hot soak, ambient above 62 degrees, full fuel load. That's why it didn't show up every single time you ran diagnostic cycles. The conditions weren't always right. And it had to be placed by someone who knew that. Had to. You don't stumble onto that kind of placement. You calculate it." Evelyn picked up the evidence bag and held it to the light. The washer looked even less significant from that angle, which was almost the point. "How long has it been there?" "Hard to say without a materials analysis. But the oxidation pattern on the bracket contact surfaces suggests it's been in place since before the aircraft was moved into the hangar for final pre-flight checks." Mason paused, which would put the installation window somewhere in the last phase of ground assembly, 6 to 8 weeks ago. Adrian moved from the window. "That's a significant accusation, Mr. Reed. You're implying someone on the assembly team." "I'm not implying anything about anyone specific," Mason said. "I'm telling you what the physical evidence suggests about timing." "And you arrived at this conclusion based on what exactly? Oxidation patterns you observed with a pen light?" The question had an edge to it that wasn't quite professional. Mason had heard that edge before, the particular tone of someone who wasn't actually asking a question so much as establishing that your answer wasn't going to count for much. "I arrived at it based on 11 years of aircraft reliability engineering and the fact that I've been watching this fault pattern for 2.5 weeks, Mason said. He kept his voice level. "The oxidation read is preliminary. I'd want a lab confirmation. But the signal behavior analysis is solid, and if you pull the maintenance logs for the final assembly phase, you'll either find a record of that washer being installed, which means it was authorized, which raises its own questions, or you won't find any record at all, which tells you something different." The silence in the room had a particular texture. Evelyn was looking at Adrian. Adrian was looking at Mason. "Pull the logs," Evelyn said. Adrian didn't move immediately. Just a half-second delay, the kind you don't notice unless you're watching for it. Then he nodded and left the room. Evelyn set the evidence bag back on the desk. She looked tired in a way that the professional composure couldn't quite cover anymore. "You said you left aircraft reliability engineering. What happened?" Mason had expected her to circle back to that eventually. "Personal reasons." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She studied him for a moment, then let it go, which told him something about her. Not every executive knew when to stop pushing. The ones who did were usually the ones worth working for. "I'm going to need you available today," she said. "Whatever you're scheduled for, I'll have Martinez reassign." "All right." "And Mason." She waited until he looked at her. "What you did this morning. I want you to understand that I recognize what it cost you to step forward. A lot of people in your position would have kept their heads down." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He picked up his work jacket from the back of the chair and left. The maintenance logs for the X900's final assembly phase ran to 1,100 pages in the digital system. Every bolt torqued, every component installed, every inspection signed off, cross-referenced and time-stamped and theoretically traceable to the individual technician who performed each task. Theoretically. Mason spent the better part of 4 hours in a small conference room off the main hangar with a laptop and a printed copy of the assembly sequence checklist, going through the logs the way he'd been trained to go through them back when going through logs was his job. Not searching for anything specific at first, just reading, getting a feel for the rhythm of the records, the way the entries were spaced, the way the language changed between different technicians' entries. Some wrote in tight, minimal language, just the facts and the sign-off, while others added notes, observations, small deviations from procedure that had been flagged and resolved. The ECM bracket installation entry was on page 847. Or rather, the entry for the ECM bracket installation was on page 847, and it was 4 words shorter than every comparable installation entry in the entire log sequence. Mason read it 3 times to make sure he wasn't manufacturing significance where there wasn't any. He wasn't. Every other bracket installation in the lower engine bay had been logged with a note confirming the connection, torque values, and the absence of foreign objects at the junction point. Standard language, part of the installation checklist. This one didn't have that note. The entry jumped straight from bracket installed to the sign-off code. A small thing. The kind of small thing that got missed in 1,100 pages of records because the entry itself existed, which meant the installation was technically documented, which meant it would pass a routine audit. Mason wrote the page number on a notepad and kept reading. He found 2 more anomalies in the next 3 hours. One was a repair expense record for a component that didn't appear anywhere else in the assembly log, a wiring harness junction adapter billed at $1,400 from a vendor called Stratus Technical Supply. He searched the vendor database. Stratus Technical Supply had one previous transaction with Hartwell, 18 months earlier, also for a small amount, also for a component that appeared nowhere in any assembly record. The other anomaly was simpler, a 6-hour gap in the security camera footage for the engine bay area, logged as a system maintenance window, on a date that didn't correspond to any scheduled infrastructure maintenance he could find in the facility's logs. By the time Connor Hayes knocked on the conference room door at 2 in the afternoon, Mason had filled 4 pages of his notepad and was beginning to understand that the washer was not the problem. The washer was the symptom. Hayes leaned in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. He looked like he wanted to say something, but hadn't fully committed to what it was going to be. Eventually, he came in and sat down across from Mason. "I owe you an apology," Hayes said. "You don't." "I do. When you came to the engine area this morning, I wasn't exactly—" He stopped. "I've had people with no qualifications tell me how to do my job about 400 times in the past 2 years. I made an assumption. It wasn't right." Mason looked at him. Hayes was being straight about it, which took something. "I've made the same assumption in the other direction," Mason said. "Figured the people with the credentials had it covered and kept my mouth shut when I should have said something." Hayes nodded. He looked at the notepad. "Find anything?" Mason turned it toward him. Hayes read through the entries and his expression changed as he went, not dramatically, but in the small increments of someone whose mental model of a situation is being rearranged in real time. "The Stratus invoices," Hayes said. "You've seen them before." "No, but I've seen the format. We had a similar issue in the testing phase of the X700 program. Someone was running dummy vendor invoices through the maintenance budget. It got caught eventually, but not before a significant amount had moved." He paused. "It was before my time. I only know because of the audit documentation." "How much moved in the X700 situation?" Hayes looked at him steadily. "About 300,000 over 14 months." Mason thought about the 2 Stratus invoices he'd found in 4 hours of searching. He thought about how much he hadn't searched yet. "I think this is bigger than that," he said. Grace Turner had been Hartwell's external auditor for 6 years, which meant she had seen the company's financial architecture in more detail than most of the people who worked there, including some of the people who were supposed to be managing it. She was in her early 40s, had a manner that was direct without being aggressive, and had the particular quality of someone who spent most of their professional life reading numbers and had learned to read people the same way, looking for the places where the pattern didn't hold. Evelyn had called her that morning 2 hours after the engine ran clean for the first time in 18 days. Grace had arrived by 1 o'clock with her laptop and a portable hard drive, and a look on her face that suggested she already suspected she wasn't going to like what she found. By 4 o'clock, she had pulled transaction records going back 22 months. She found Mason and Hayes in the conference room and sat down without preamble. She opened her laptop and turned it to face them. Stratus Technical Supply is one of 7, she said. 7 vendor accounts that appear in maintenance and operational expenditures over the past 22 months that don't correspond to any legitimate parts inventory. The invoices are formatted correctly, they're within approval threshold amounts so they don't trigger secondary review, and they're spread across 4 different budget categories, so no single category shows unusual activity. Mason looked at the screen. The numbers were organized in a clean summary table. Vendor name, total amount billed, number of transactions, the budget category each one fell under. The total at the bottom of the column was $4.2 million. Hayes sat back in his chair. $4 million, Mason said. 4.2, Grace said. Give or take. I need another day to pull the full transaction history, but this is the broad picture. She paused. This has been running for almost 2 years. Whoever set it up knew what they were doing. The threshold management alone suggests someone who understood our internal approval controls. Someone on the inside, Hayes said. Has to be. You'd need system access to create vendor accounts, push invoices, and ensure they got processed without triggering review flags. That's not a low-level access profile. Mason was quiet. He was thinking about Adrian Blake standing at the window with his arms folded, and the half-second before he moved when Evelyn told him to pull the logs. He was thinking about the security camera gap logged as a system maintenance window. He was thinking about the fact that operations directors typically held the kind of system access Grace was describing. He wasn't ready to say any of that out loud. Not yet. The evidence was pointing somewhere, but pointing and proving were different things, and Mason had learned in a previous life that the cost of pointing at the wrong person was not something you came back from easily. Does Evelyn know about the $4 million? He asked. She will in about 10 minutes, Grace said. I wanted to walk you through it first because you found the initial anomalies, and I needed to know if there was anything in the maintenance records that connected directly to the vendor accounts. The Stratus invoices list a wiring harness junction adapter, Mason said. That component doesn't appear in the assembly records, but a washer placed at the wiring harness junction does appear in the aircraft. It just doesn't appear in any maintenance log. Grace looked at him for a moment. So the vendor account may have been the payment mechanism for the sabotage materials. Or for someone's time, Mason said, or both. The meeting with Evelyn that followed was not comfortable for anyone in the room. Grace laid out the financial picture in the measured, factual language of someone who was very aware that the information she was delivering was the kind that caused companies to lose board members, and board members to lose freedom. Evelyn listened without interrupting, which Mason had already identified as one of her distinguishing qualities. She let information arrive complete before she responded to it. When Grace finished, Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. You're telling me someone has been stealing from this company for almost 2 years, she said, and using that theft infrastructure to fund a sabotage of our lead aircraft, so that the program fails, the stock drops, and someone is positioned to benefit from the collapse, Grace said. That's the logical conclusion of the pattern, yes. Who has the access profile you're describing? Grace and Mason looked at each other. Not because they had agreed to look at each other, but because they had arrived at the same answer from different directions, and neither of them wanted to be the one to say it first. I need another 24 hours to confirm the access logs, Grace said. I don't want to name anyone based on circumstantial alignment. Evelyn turned to Mason. What about you? He thought about how to answer that. He thought about Adrian in this very room 8 hours ago, asking him a pointed question with an edge that wasn't quite professional. He thought about timing and access, and the way the financial structure Grace had described required someone who understood both the operational systems and the financial controls, someone whose job gave them a natural reason to be in both. I think you should secure the audit records, Mason said. Physical and digital, right now, tonight. Don't run it through the normal administrative channels. Evelyn looked at him carefully. You're telling me not to trust my own administrative channels. I'm telling you that whoever did this has been operating inside your administrative channels for 2 years without being caught, Mason said. Until the records are secured independently, I'd treat the internal systems as potentially compromised. The room was quiet. The engine, all the way across the building in the main hangar, had been shut down for the night. There was nothing to hear. But Evelyn Hart sat in the silence with an expression that told Mason she was hearing something anyway. The particular sound of a company she had spent 20 years building, turning out to have a fracture running through it that she hadn't seen. She nodded, once. Grace, you have authorization to pull whatever you need and store it off-site, tonight. Then she looked at Mason again with the expression of someone who had figured out that the man they'd brought in to explain a technical problem had also become, without anyone planning for it, the most important person in the room. You realize, she said, that when this gets out, and it will get out, you're going to be the one who started pulling on the thread. Mason understood what she was telling him. He'd pulled on threads before. He knew what happened to the person holding the end when everything unraveled. I know, he said. What he didn't say, what he kept to himself as he walked back through the hangar that evening, past the Apex X900 sitting quiet and enormous in the artificial light, its right engine finally at rest, was that he had a feeling the thread wasn't finished unraveling yet. Not by a long way. The washer had been the beginning. Someone had put it there, and that someone had access and knowledge and a financial infrastructure that had been running for almost 2 years. That didn't happen by accident. That didn't happen without a plan. And plans, in Mason's experience, rarely stopped at the first move. Mason got home at 11:15 that night and stood in the kitchen for a while without turning on the overhead light. The street lamp outside came through the window at a low angle and made the room look like somewhere he'd never been, which wasn't entirely inaccurate. He'd been working nights for 3 years and spent more waking hours inside Hartwell's hangar than in this apartment. There were dishes in the sink from 2 days ago, a jacket on the back of a chair that he didn't remember leaving there, small evidence of a life being lived on the margins of itself. He made coffee because it was what he did when he couldn't sleep, which was most nights, and sat at the kitchen table with his notepad and thought about everything Grace Turner had laid out in that conference room. $4.2 million, 7 phantom vendors, 22 months of patient, methodical theft that had never once tripped a review flag because whoever designed the scheme understood the review system from the inside. He thought about Adrian Blake. He hadn't said the name out loud to Evelyn, and he was still glad he hadn't. Saying a name changed things. Once a name was in the air, the whole weight of the situation gathered around it, and if the name turned out to be wrong, that weight didn't redistribute evenly. It came down hardest on the person who said it. Mason knew that from experience. He'd made that mistake exactly once before, in a different company, in a different life, and the professional consequences had followed him for 2 years before he'd finally stopped trying to recover from them and started over as something else entirely. So he sat with the name and didn't say it and drank his coffee, and at some point the kitchen got lighter and he realized morning had arrived again without him noticing the transition. Bob, he was back at Hartwell by 6:30. The hangar felt different that morning, not calmer exactly, but differently tense. The kind of tension that replaces frantic activity when the activity stops and everyone is waiting to find out what the activity was for. The Apex X900 sat where it had always sat, but the diagnostic terminals had been pushed to the periphery overnight, and 2 of the consultant team's equipment rigs had been partially broken down, as if Crane's people had been told to begin preparing for departure without being told definitively that they were leaving. Connor Hayes was already at the aircraft when Mason arrived, running a set of manual checks on the starboard engine with the methodical attention of someone who wanted to be very sure about something. He looked up when Mason came over. Clean all the way through, Hayes said. I've been here since 5, ran the startup cycle twice. Not a single anomaly. He paused. I wanted to see it for myself. Without the fault in there, it runs exactly the way the design specs say it should run. Good, Mason said. You sleep? Some. Hayes gave him a look that suggested he found this answer unconvincing but wasn't going to press it. Grace came in early. She's been in the records room since before I arrived. Whatever she's pulling, she's not sharing yet. Mason nodded. He stood looking at the engine for a moment, the clean lines of the cowling, the intake mouth, the components that he now knew intimately in a way that 3 weeks of watching had made possible. "I want to do something today," he said, "before this gets any further along." "What kind of something?" "I want to trace the physical access history for this aircraft, not the digital badge logs. Those can be manipulated. I want to talk to the people who were actually physically present during the assembly and pre-flight phases. The technicians, the ground crew, the inspection staff. People who might have seen something and not known it mattered." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "That's going to step on some toes. Those teams report through operations." Through Adrian, Mason didn't say, "I know. I can help with that. I have direct working relationships with most of the senior techs. If we frame it as a reliability review rather than an investigation, people will be more likely to talk openly." Hayes looked at him steadily. "Is that what it is? A reliability review?" "Among other things," Mason said. They spent the morning working through a list of 14 people, technicians, inspectors, and one ground crew supervisor named Dolores Vance, who had been present for almost the entire pre-flight ground phase and had a reputation, Hayes said, for noticing things. Hayes made the introductions, kept the conversations relaxed, and stepped back when Mason started asking the specific questions. It was a good division of labor that neither of them had explicitly negotiated. It had just settled into place naturally, which told Mason something about Hayes that the arguments around the diagnostic terminals hadn't. Most of the conversations were unremarkable. The technicians remembered their work clearly and professionally. The inspections had been standard. The timeline had been compressed near the end, but not unusually so. Nobody reported anything that felt out of place. Dolores Vance was the last one they talked to. She was in her 50s, had been with Hartwell for 14 years, and had the particular quality of long-experienced ground crew supervisors, a combination of institutional memory and zero patience for being managed by people who knew less than she did. She listened to Mason's framing of the conversation without expression, then said, "This is about the washer somebody found in the ECM bracket, isn't it?" Mason looked at her. "What do you know about that?" "I know I flagged an access irregularity during the lower engine bay closeout inspection, and nobody followed up on it." She said it flatly, without particular anger, the way you say a thing you've made peace with the injustice of. 3 weeks before the aircraft moved to the main hangar, I submitted a note through the operational log system saying that the lower engine bay had been accessed after my closeout inspection sign-off, before the final security seal was applied. The access record showed a maintenance authorization code, but the code wasn't associated with any scheduled task. Mason felt something solidify in his chest. "Did you get a response to that note?" "Got a response saying the access had been reviewed and cleared, signed off by operations." She paused. "Which I thought was fast, honestly. Unusually fast. But it had a proper sign-off, so I noted it and moved on." She looked at Mason with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite grievance, but somewhere in between. "Should I not have moved on?" "You followed procedure," Mason said. "I followed procedure, and somebody put something in the airplane." She looked away. "So?" The something that had solidified in Mason's chest didn't soften. The access irregularity Dolores had flagged, cleared by an operation sign-off, in a time window that matched what the oxidation evidence suggested about when the washer had been installed. It was another thread connecting to the same point. He thanked her, and she nodded and walked back toward the aircraft without waiting to be dismissed, which he respected. Grace Turner found him in the conference room at 2 in the afternoon. She came in, closed the door behind her, and put her laptop on the table with the particular precision of someone who was about to show you something they wished they didn't have to show you. "The access logs for the operations administrative system," she said. "I pulled an independent copy through the server backup infrastructure last night before anyone could alter the originals. I've been cross-referencing them against the badge access records for the physical facility." She turned the laptop. Mason looked at the screen. The vendor account creations for all 7 Phantom suppliers were initiated from a single operations administrative login, Grace said. The same login was used to process the invoice approvals. The same login cleared Dolores Vance's access irregularity flag 3 weeks before aircraft transfer. She highlighted a column on the screen. "The login is registered to Adrian Blake." Mason sat back. He'd known it was coming. had known it since that half-second pause in Evelyn's office yesterday morning. But seeing the name rendered in clean digital text, attached to specific transactions and timestamps, made it something different from a suspicion. It made it a fact, and facts had consequences that suspicions didn't. "Have you shown this to Evelyn?" he asked. "Not yet. I wanted you to see it first." She paused. "Because there's something else." She scrolled down. Another section of data, formatted differently. These were financial records, bank transaction summaries. "This morning," Grace said, "someone transferred $47,000 from a Stratus technical supply account to a personal account. The transfer was initiated yesterday evening after our meeting with Evelyn." She pointed to a line on the screen. "The personal account is registered to a Mason James Reed. Your social security number, your home address." The room was very quiet. Mason looked at the number. His name, his address, his social security number, which he had never given to anyone at Hartwell Aviation and which had no legitimate reason to appear in any of this documentation. He felt something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, something colder and more complicated than either. He'd been right that there was more thread to unravel. He just hadn't anticipated that the next pull would go through him. "It's fabricated," he said. "I know that," Grace said. "The transfer timestamp is 11:47 p.m. yesterday. I have records showing the Stratus account was accessed from an IP address registered to Hartwell's operational network at 11:51 p.m. That's a 4-minute gap. Someone set up the transfer and then immediately created the access record to document it, which means whoever did this was still in the building when we were having our meeting with Evelyn. And was watching what we found. Has to be. The response was too fast and too specific." She closed the laptop. "Mason, this is going to get worse before it gets better. Whoever did this is covering ground. They're trying to make sure that if the financial scheme gets exposed, there's a name attached to it that isn't theirs." He knew she was right. He'd seen this kind of move before. Not in aviation, but the principle was the same. When an operation starts coming apart, the person running it doesn't panic. They adapt. They redirect. They put something in the way of the people closing in, and if that something happens to be a specific person's name and account number and home address, then that specific person becomes the problem that needs to be explained before anything else can move forward. "Who else has seen this?" Mason asked. "Right now, you and me." He thought for a moment. "We need Jackson Cole." Okay. Jackson Cole ran Hartwell's facility security operations with the quiet competence of someone who had spent 15 years in security management and had learned that the job was 90% patience and 10% knowing exactly what to do when the patience ran out. He was in his late 40s, heavier than he'd been when he took the job, and had a habit of listening with his eyes closed that initially disconcerted people who didn't know him and eventually became one of the most reassuring things about him. It meant he was actually processing what you said rather than preparing his response. Mason and Grace found him in his office, told him what Grace had found, and showed him the transaction records. He listened with his eyes open this time, which was the thing that told Mason he understood the urgency. "The badge cloning," Jackson said. "That's what you're describing. Someone cloned your access credentials." "My badge wouldn't have given access to the evidence room," Mason said. "My clearance level doesn't cover it." "It doesn't have to. The clone only needs to generate a record of access. The actual entry could have been made with legitimate credentials. The clone is just there to create the log entry that points to you." Jackson leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I can check the camera footage for the evidence room entry." "The 6-hour camera gap during the engine bay closeout phase," Mason said. "Is that the only one?" Jackson looked at him. "How did you know about the camera gap?" "I found it in the facilities logs yesterday." "There are 3 others," Jackson said. "Different areas, different dates. I found them 2 weeks ago when I was doing a routine audit. I submitted a report through the standard channel." He paused. The report got closed out as resolved. System maintenance windows. The same language, the same pattern. Reports going in, clearances coming back, no follow-up, no investigation. "Who received your report?" Grace asked. Jackson didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the wall to his left, at a framed facility map that he probably hadn't really seen in years. Operations Director reviews all security incident reports, he said finally. The three of them sat with that for a moment. I need to pull the camera footage myself, Jackson said, independent of the standard archive system. I have a secondary backup that feeds directly to an off-site server. Started it 6 months ago after the first gap showed up. Adrian doesn't know about it. How long will it take? Mason asked. If the footage exists, I can have it reviewed in 3 hours. Adrian Blake called a meeting of the senior technical staff at 4 o'clock that afternoon. It was framed as a program review, a status update on the aircraft's readiness following the fault resolution. Standard procedure. The kind of meeting that made perfect sense to call after an 18-day grounding was finally resolved. Mason was not on the invitation list. He found out about the meeting from Hayes, who texted him a one-line message 20 minutes before it started. Blake's calling everyone in. You're not included. Thought you should know. He was in the security office with Jackson when the message came. He read it and set his phone down on the desk and didn't say anything for a moment. He's controlling the narrative, Grace said. She was sitting across from him, waiting for Jackson to finish pulling the secondary footage. Trying to, Mason said. He doesn't know what we have. He knows we have something. He's known since last night when he set up the transfer. Mason picked up his phone again and turned it over in his hands. The question is whether he thinks he's ahead of it. Based on the transfer, Grace said, I think he believes you're going to be the story, not him. She was probably right. From Adrian's position, the situation had a particular logic to it. The maintenance worker who found the sabotage was now connected to a suspicious financial transfer, and the investigation, if properly directed, would spend its next several days trying to explain Mason Reed's apparent connection to a phantom vendor account before it got anywhere near Adrian Blake. It was a good move. Not a clean move, but a structurally sound one, and it would have worked if Grace hadn't already secured an independent copy of the access logs before the transfer was set up. Jackson turned his monitor toward them. Found it, he said. The footage was time-stamped from the secondary backup system and showed a corridor outside the physical evidence storage room at 11:53 p.m. the previous night. The angle was slightly different from the main camera, lower, wider, and showed more of the hallway than the standard footage would have. A figure entered the corridor from the left. Jackson paused the footage, enhanced the image as much as the resolution allowed. That's not Mason Reed, Grace said quietly. It wasn't. The figure was taller, broader through the shoulders, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been in this building at this hour before and wasn't concerned about being seen. The face wasn't fully visible, but the build, the gait, the specific gray operations department fleece that the figure was wearing, none of it was Mason. Jackson printed a still frame and set it on the desk between them. He didn't say the name. He didn't need to. Evelyn's office at 5 p.m. had the quality of a room where the last several certainties a person held had recently been revised. She sat behind her desk with the still frame in front of her and Grace's transaction records in a folder to her right, and didn't look at either of them for a long moment after Mason and Grace finished talking. Mason had expected something from her, some version of the executive response to a crisis, the controlled language, the calibrated reaction, the immediate pivot to damage control, and legal consultation. What he got instead was silence, and then a very quiet. He's been with this company for 4 years. I know, Grace said. He was in every program review meeting for the X900, every budget discussion, She stopped. She wasn't looking at the documents anymore. She was looking at a point somewhere past the wall of her office, at something Mason couldn't see. He knew where everything was, what everything was worth. He knew exactly what losing the Meridian contract would do to our stock position. And he's positioned to benefit from that, Grace said. We haven't traced the downstream accounts yet, but the pattern suggests he has financial exposure to Hartwell's stock going in the wrong direction. Short position, Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. Most likely. Evelyn picked up the still frame and looked at it. The particular quality of how she held it, carefully, like something that might break, or like something that might change if she pressed it too hard, told Mason everything about the difference between suspecting a person and having their image in your hand. What do you need from me? She said finally. 24 more hours before anyone else knows what we have, Mason said. And I need you to do something that's going to be uncomfortable. She looked at him. "The board will pressure you to suspend me," he said. "Based on the transfer record, once that becomes visible, and it will become visible when the financial review widens, someone on the board is going to flag it and push for a suspension to protect the company's position during the investigation." "You want me to let them," Evelyn said slowly. "I want you to not fight it, not publicly. Let the narrative run for one day. While it's running, Adrian will think he's ahead of the situation. If he thinks he's ahead, he'll move the next piece. And the next piece tells us something we don't already know. It connects what we have to the full scope of what he's planned," Mason said. "Right now we can place him in the building. We can connect him to the vendor accounts. We can show the sabotage and the fabricated transfer. But the question of what his full exit plan looks like, how he intended to profit from Hartwell's collapse, that's still incomplete. You want him to show us the rest of it. I want him to think he's won long enough to finish showing us." Evelyn set the still frame back on the desk and looked at it for another moment. Then she straightened in her chair, which was the gesture of someone setting aside the part of themselves that had been in that office for 4 years with a man she'd apparently never fully known, and becoming the other version of herself, the one that had rebuilt this company once before and apparently was going to have to do it again. "All right," she said. The suspension notice reached Mason at 7:40 the following morning, 3 minutes after he'd arrived at the hangar. It came through the HR system as a formal administrative hold pending financial review. The language was careful and non-accusatory, which meant the lawyers had already been involved, which meant the board had moved faster than Mason had anticipated by about 6 hours. He stood in the main hangar holding his phone and reading the message and thought about what it felt like to be in the position he was in, to have found the thing, to have started pulling the thread, to have traced it as far as he'd been able to trace it, and to now be standing in the middle of the result with a suspension notice on his phone and a fabricated financial transaction in a record somewhere with his name on it. It didn't feel like anything grand. It didn't feel like injustice in a cinematic sense, the way stories sometimes made those moments feel. It felt like being very tired and standing in a large cold building and reading bad news off a phone screen. Hayes was across the hangar near the aircraft. He saw Mason's face and came over. "What happened?" Mason showed him the phone. Hayes read it. His jaw tightened. He looked like he was going to say something forceful, and then he visibly decided against it, which was a more controlled response than Mason had expected from him. "Evelyn knows about this?" Hayes asked. "She authorized it." Hayes looked at him for a long moment. "You told her to." "I need you to keep working the technical side," Mason said. "The aircraft prep, the pre-demonstration checks, all of it. Don't change anything in your routine." "And you?" Mason pocketed the phone. He looked at the Apex X900, the aircraft that had started all of this, that had sat in this hangar for 18 days while everyone looked at data and missed the machine. "I'll be close," he said. "Just not here." He picked up his jacket and walked toward the exit, and behind him the hangar was quiet, and the aircraft sat in its center unchanged, and somewhere in the building a man who thought he had maneuvered himself into a winning position was about to make the mistake that people in winning positions almost always make. He was about to move his next piece. The apartment Mason was renting felt smaller during the day. He'd never really spent daylight hours in it. 3 years of night shifts meant that the apartment existed, in his experience, primarily as a dark place where he slept and ate and occasionally sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. In daylight, it was just a collection of furniture and dishes and a view of a parking structure across the street that had nothing interesting to offer at any hour. He sat at the kitchen table with his phone and his notepad and a cup of coffee that had gone cold and thought about the aircraft. Specifically, he thought about what he would do if he were Adrian Blake. The financial scheme was partially exposed. Adrian had to know that, had to have known it the moment Grace started pulling independent records. The fabricated transfer had bought time, redirected attention, put Mason's name in the frame. The suspension would hold for at least 24 hours while the board processed the financial review. That was the window Adrian had created for himself. The question was what he intended to do with it. Mason turned that over for a while. He thought about the scope of what they'd established. $4.2 million over 22 months. A short position on Hartwell stock. A sabotage designed to kill the X900 program and collapse the company's value. The financial play only worked if the program actually failed. The washer had been removed. The aircraft was running clean. The Meridian demonstration was scheduled for the day after tomorrow. If Adrian intended to profit from Hartwell's collapse, he needed the demonstration to fail, which meant the washer hadn't been his only move. Mason picked up his phone and called Grace. She answered on the second ring.
I was about to call you.
He has another device in the aircraft, Mason said. A brief pause. That's where I was landing too. The financial position doesn't pay unless the program fails. With the washer gone and the engine running clean, the demonstration goes forward and the Meridian contract holds. That's not the outcome he structured 2 years of work toward. How much time do we have? Demonstration is Thursday at 10 a.m. It's Tuesday morning now. She paused. Mason, if there's another device, it won't be in the same location. He'll know we looked at the ECM bracket area. Different system entirely, Mason said. Somewhere that doesn't get a full physical inspection during standard pre-flight checks. He'd need it to produce a fault that's plausible enough to abort the demonstration without immediately suggesting sabotage, something that looks like a genuine aircraft issue rather than another planted signal. Brake system, Grace said. Mason stopped. Why brake system? Because I just pulled the maintenance access logs for last night. At 2:17 a.m., an operations administrative override was used to open the restricted maintenance bay access for the aircraft's landing gear and brake system service panel. The override was logged under a general scheduled maintenance code. She paused again. There was no scheduled maintenance on the brake system last night. He was already standing up. I need to get back into the hangar. You're suspended. Your badge access is frozen. Then I need someone who isn't. Hayes met him in the parking lot outside the facility's east entrance at 9:45 a.m. He came out through the employee access door with the particular expression of someone who had been thinking hard for the past hour and hadn't arrived anywhere comfortable. If you're right about the brake system, Hayes said, keeping his voice down even in the open air, and we go to the aircraft now and start pulling panels, Adrian knows within 20 minutes. He's watching every movement on that floor today. I know. And if we find something, what then? We've already got footage, financial records, access logs. At what point does Grace take all of this to the board directly rather than letting this continue? When we have the complete picture, Mason said. Right now we can show preparation and intent. We can show financial motive and fabricated evidence. But the device, if it exists, is the piece that connects everything. It's proof that the sabotage wasn't opportunistic. It was planned. It was continued after the first attempt failed, and it was ongoing while he was actively trying to redirect blame onto me. Hayes leaned against the wall and looked at a point somewhere past Mason's shoulder. I've worked with Adrian Blake for 4 years, he said. I've sat in rooms with him. I've disagreed with him about program decisions. I argued with him about the diagnostic approach for 2 of the 18 days before you found the washer. He shook his head. I had no idea. People who do this kind of thing are generally very good at being who you need them to be, Mason said. That's supposed to make me feel less stupid? It's supposed to be accurate. Hayes almost smiled at that. Not quite. He pushed off the wall. What do you need? I need you to do nothing different today. Run your normal pre-demonstration checks. Act like the demonstration is proceeding exactly as planned. If Adrian is watching, and he is, I need him to see a normal day. And tonight? Tonight I need access to the aircraft. Hayes looked at him. Jackson can arrange a secondary access path through the maintenance tunnel. It doesn't route through the main badge system. He paused. If I help you get in there tonight and something goes wrong, then I was never there, Mason said. You gave me nothing. You knew nothing. That's not what I was going to say. Hayes looked at him steadily. I was going to say that if something goes wrong, I want to know about it before anyone else does, so I can help. Mason looked at him. This engineer who 2 days ago had watched him with the skeptical patience of someone tolerating a layperson's opinion, and who was now standing in a parking lot offering to absorb professional risk on his behalf. People surprised you, usually in the wrong direction, but sometimes in this one. All right, Mason said. The day moved slowly in the way that days move when you're waiting for something and trying not to look like you're waiting. Mason drove back to the apartment and ate something and tried to sleep for 2 hours without success. then sat with his notepad and worked through the brake system architecture in his memory. He'd never worked directly on X900 brake components, but he'd studied the aircraft's systems documentation thoroughly enough over 3 years to have a functional picture. The brake system's BSCU, the brake system control unit, managed anti-skid and auto-brake functions through a hydraulic pressure regulation circuit. A fault in that circuit during taxi would produce a brake pressure warning that the flight crew would be required to evaluate before continuing. Depending on how the fault was generated, it could range from a nuisance alert that an experienced crew would dismiss to a safety-critical warning that would mandate immediate abort of the demonstration. If he were planning a device in that system, he would want something that produced the latter. He called Grace at 2 p.m. Has anyone been able to look at Adrian's communications, email, internal messaging? Not without a legal process we don't have yet, she said. Jackson has the facility camera coverage, I have the financial and access records, but actual communications that's a different category. Why? I'm trying to establish whether he has an outside contact, someone receiving the short position proceeds or coordinating the timing of the demonstration failure. If there's a communication trail, it ties the financial motive to the sabotage in a way that the board can't reframe as circumstantial. The board meeting is tomorrow morning, Grace said. Evelyn has called an emergency session. She's planning to present what we have. Before the demonstration? That was her call. She said she wasn't going to run a demonstration with a potentially compromised aircraft and a potentially compromised operations director without first resolving the board's position. Grace paused. She also said, and I'm quoting her, that she was done managing the optics of a situation she hadn't created. Mason thought about that. It was the right call and the risky call simultaneously, which was usually what the right call looked like. Does Adrian know about the board meeting? Board members were notified by the chair directly. It was marked confidential. He'll know, Mason said. He has enough visibility into the board's communication channels that a confidential emergency session gets flagged whether or not he's explicitly told. Another pause. Which means he may move the timeline up. Which is why I need to be in the aircraft tonight. If he activates the device before the demonstration rather than during it, remotely, from somewhere outside the facility, we need to have already found it. Jackson Cole's secondary maintenance access ran through a service tunnel on the facility's north side, connecting the support infrastructure to the main hangar floor through a passage that existed in the original building plans and had been used occasionally for heavy equipment movement, but was not part of the standard access routing. It didn't have badge readers. It had a mechanical lock that Jackson had a key for, and a camera at the tunnel entrance that fed to Jackson's secondary backup system, rather than the main security archive. At 11 p.m., Mason came through the tunnel with a pen light and a tool pouch that Hayes had left in a locker near the north service entrance. Jackson walked him to the tunnel door, handed him the key, and said, "You've got 4 hours before the morning crew starts arriving. If you find something, call me before you touch it. I want it documented in place." Understood. And Mason. Jackson looked at him with the steady attention that he usually reserved for his eyes-closed listening posture. Be careful, not because of the device, although be careful about that too, but if Adrian is monitoring internal systems tonight and he sees anything that suggests the aircraft is being accessed, the situation changes fast. Mason nodded and went into the tunnel. The hangar at midnight had a different quality from the hangar at any other hour. The industrial lighting ran at reduced levels overnight, and the shadows gathered under the wings and along the walls in ways that made the space feel both larger and more intimate than it did in the daylight hours, when it was populated and purposeful. The Apex X900 sat where it always sat, enormous and quiet, and Mason approached it the way he always approached it, not as a monument or a problem or a symbol of anything, but as a machine. A collection of components and systems and connections, all of which behaved according to physical laws that didn't care what anyone thought of them. He started at the brake system service panel on the left main gear bay. He worked methodically, the way he'd worked under the starboard engine 3 days ago, by feel as much as by sight, moving through the architecture of the system without rushing, checking the places where a device could be introduced without disrupting normal function until it was activated. The BSCU housing was clean. The hydraulic pressure transducers were clean. The anti-skid valve assembly was clean. He moved to the right main gear bay and started over. He found it 40 minutes in, behind the right main gear brake pressure transducer mounting. Not a washer this time. A small wireless signal injector, a custom-built component, roughly the size of a thick matchbox, fitted with a magnetic mount that held it against the transducer housing, and a micro antenna that would receive an external activation signal and inject a pre-programmed fault voltage into the pressure circuit. More sophisticated than the washer, more expensive. The kind of thing that required actual engineering capability to design and fabricate. Mason took 3 photographs with his phone before he touched it. Then he called Jackson. "Found it," he said. "Right main gear brake bay behind the pressure transducer. It's a wireless injector. Remote activation." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "Can you tell if it's been activated?" "No, it's passive until it receives the trigger signal." Mason looked at the device. "Jackson, this thing receives a signal, which means someone is going to send that signal at a specific time, probably during the demonstration taxi sequence, same moment the original fault was intended to occur. And if we remove it tonight, he knows it's been found." "Right." Another silence. "So we leave it." "We leave it," Mason said. "But we need to be able to intercept the activation signal. If we can capture the signal transmission, we can trace the source." "I know someone who can set that up," Jackson said. "Electronics countermeasure background. I'll make some calls." He paused. "Get out of there. Document what you have and get out." The board meeting convened at 8 a.m. Thursday, 2 hours before the scheduled demonstration. Evelyn presented Grace's financial documentation, Jackson's camera footage, and the access log analysis in the measured, factual language of someone who had spent the night deciding exactly how to say things that were going to be very difficult to hear. Mason wasn't in the room. He was in the security office with Jackson and a former military electronics technician named Rourke, who had been Jackson's contact and who had spent the previous night setting up a signal monitoring array around the aircraft's position in the demonstration area. Adrian Blake was in the board meeting. He had been notified as a participant, which was standard for operations director involvement in program status reviews, and he had arrived on time and sat in his usual place and behaved, by all accounts from Hayes, who was also present, like someone who had not spent the previous 2 years stealing from the company and sabotaging its flagship aircraft. Grace told Mason afterward that watching Adrian sit through the first 40 minutes of the meeting, through the vendor account presentation, through the access log analysis, through the camera footage from outside the evidence room, had been one of the more unsettling things she'd witnessed in a professional context. He kept his face calibrated. Attentive, slightly concerned, the expression of a senior executive taking in serious information about a serious problem. He interjected twice with questions that were technically reasonable and substantively irrelevant. It wasn't until Evelyn put the still frame on the screen, the corridor footage, the figure in the operations department fleece, that something shifted in his face. Grace said it was small. Just a slight adjustment around the eyes, lasting less than a second. The recalibration of someone who has just understood that the map they were navigating from was wrong in a way they hadn't accounted for. Evelyn said, "The board will note that this footage was recovered from an independent backup system and carries a verified timestamp. It shows access to the evidence storage area at 11:53 p.m. on Tuesday, approximately 4 minutes after the initiation of a financial transfer to an account registered to Mason Reed." She looked at Adrian. "I'd like to give you an opportunity to explain what you were doing in that corridor, Adrian." The room was very quiet. Adrian Blake looked at the image on the screen for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man performing the mental calculation of someone who has just been shown that the exit they plan to use is no longer available and is rapidly identifying the next one. "I think," he said, "this warrants a conversation with legal counsel before I respond to anything." "Agreed," Evelyn said. "In the meantime, the board is voting on an immediate suspension of your access and authority pending investigation." She looked at the room. All in favor. The vote was not close. What happened next happened fast, which was the thing about situations that had been building for a long time. When they broke all at once. Adrian Blake left the board meeting at 8:57 a.m. with 2 members of Hartwell's legal team accompanying him at Evelyn's direction. He was not under physical restraint and was not being detained, Hartwell was a company, not a law enforcement body, but the accompaniment was enough to communicate that his movement through the facility was being observed. At 9:14 a.m., Rourke's signal monitoring array picked up an activation transmission targeted at the frequency profile of the wireless injector Mason had found in the right main gear bay. The transmission originated from a device on the facility grounds. Jackson tracked the signal to the parking structure across from the facility's main entrance, third level, northeast corner. He sent 2 of his security team there immediately and called Mason. "He transmitted," Jackson said. "From inside the facility?" "Parking structure. My people are moving." Mason thought about the timeline. The board meeting had been longer than Adrian expected. He'd lost access and authority, been accompanied out of the room and made his move, tried to activate the device remotely from the parking structure while still on facility grounds. Fast, reactive, exactly the kind of move someone makes when they've lost the advantage and are trying to salvage something from a situation that stopped being controllable. "The device didn't produce a fault," Mason said. It wasn't a question. "Correct. The aircraft is in pre-demonstration position. No fault warnings. The signal was transmitted and received. Rourke confirmed the injector received the activation, but I had Rourke install a blocking circuit in the transducer line last night. The signal got to the device and went nowhere." For a moment, Mason just stood in the security office and let the specific texture of that information settle over him. The signal had transmitted. The device had received it. Adrian had pressed whatever button he had, expecting the brake warning to appear on the aircraft's systems, expecting the demonstration to abort, expecting the domino that started everything else. The stock drop, the contract collapse, the financial payoff on a short position that had been 18 months in the making, and nothing had happened. Jackson's security team found Adrian Blake on the third level of the parking structure with a modified signal transmitter in his jacket pocket and an expression that had stopped performing anything at all. The Meridian Group's procurement team arrived at 10 a.m. as scheduled and found the demonstration proceeding as planned. They were not told at that point about the events of the preceding 72 hours. Evelyn had made the decision, with the board's agreement and legal counsel's guidance, to allow the demonstration to proceed as a separate matter from the internal investigation, both because the aircraft was confirmed clean and because canceling the demonstration would have created questions that couldn't be answered publicly yet. Mason watched the demonstration from the roof of the facility support building, which was accessible through a maintenance stairwell and gave a clear sight line to the runway approach and taxi area. He had no official reason to be there, but Jackson knew where he was, and Evelyn had not told him to leave the facility grounds after the board meeting, which he took as a kind of implicit permission. The Apex X900 taxied out at 10:15. The morning was clear, the wind was manageable, and the aircraft moved down the taxiway with the smooth, deliberate authority of a machine that had been designed for exactly this moment and was finally, after everything, being allowed to do it. The right engine ran clean throughout. No brake warnings, no false fault signals, no system anomalies of any kind. Hayes was in the crew observation area at ground level, and Mason couldn't see his face from this distance, but he could see the way Hayes was standing, still, arms at his sides, watching the aircraft with the focused intensity of an engineer watching his work function the way it was supposed to function, and finding that it does. Mason leaned against the rooftop railing and watched the X900 lift off the runway and climb into the morning sky, and he thought about the washer. Small, off-white, barely the size of a shirt button, sitting in a clear evidence bag on a mahogany desk. The thing that had started all of this, or rather the thing that had revealed what was already there, the fraud and the planning and the particular patient malice of someone who had decided that other people's work was acceptable collateral for his own gain. The aircraft climbed until it was a point of light and sound against the blue, and then the sound was just the sound of morning, and Mason stayed on the roof for a while after the aircraft was out of sight because there was nowhere in particular he needed to be, and the air up there was cleaner than it was at ground level. His phone rang. It was Grace. "Investigators are at the facility," she said. "They want statements, yours included." "I'm here." "There's something else." A pause. "The downstream financial accounts, the ones we couldn't trace before. With the transmitter as evidence and Adrian in custody, The investigators were able to get emergency access to the account structure within the past hour. Another pause. Mason, the short position was worth about $9 million if Hartwell's stock dropped to the projected level after a failed demonstration. He stood with that for a moment. $9 million, 2 years of work. A man who sat in rooms and shook hands and asked technically reasonable questions, and who had been running a parallel calculation the entire time about how much everything around him was worth if it failed. "Are you still there?" Grace asked. "Yeah," Mason said. "I'm coming down." He took one more look at the sky where the aircraft had been, then turned toward the stairwell door and went back inside. The investigators were thorough in the way that people are thorough when they understand that the paperwork they're generating is going to be read by other people in formal settings for a long time. They set up in 3 conference rooms on Hartwell's second floor and worked through the witness list methodically. Grace first, then Jackson, then Hayes, then Dolores Vance, who gave her statement about the access irregularity flag with the same flat factual delivery she'd used when she told Mason about it, as if she'd been rehearsing the account in her head for 3 weeks and was relieved to finally give it to someone with the authority to do something about it. Mason's interview lasted 2.5 hours. He sat across from 2 investigators, a woman named Carver, who asked most of the questions, and a man named Thill who took notes and occasionally asked follow-up questions that were more precise than they sounded, and walked through everything from the beginning. The fault pattern he'd observed over 2.5 weeks of night shifts, the washer, the maintenance log anomalies, Grace's financial findings, the camera footage, the wireless injector in the brake bay, the signal transmission from the parking structure. Carver listened with the focused attention of someone doing a job they were good at. She didn't perform reaction. When Mason described finding the injector at midnight in the hangar with a pen light, she wrote something on her notepad and asked, "Did you have authorization to access the aircraft at that time?" "I was suspended," Mason said. "That's not what I asked." "No," Mason said. "I didn't have formal authorization." Carver looked at him steadily. "Why did you go anyway?" He thought about how to answer that, not performing the answer, actually thinking about it, because it was a real question and it deserved a real answer. "Because I was the only one who knew where to look," he said. "And if I waited for the authorization process to run while Adrian Blake still had facility access and a functional remote transmitter, the device would have been activated before anyone found it." "You could have told someone else where to look." "I could have, see, but I wasn't sure the information would stay contained. The scheme had been running for 2 years inside Hartwell's systems. I didn't know how far the access went." He paused. "I made a judgment call." "Was it the right one?" "The aircraft flew clean this morning," Mason said. "So probably." Carver almost smiled at that. Not quite. She wrote something else on her notepad, and the interview continued. "Uset." And, by the time he walked out of the conference room at 4 in the afternoon, the facility had taken on the particular quality of a place where something significant has happened, and everyone is still calibrating how significant. Groups of employees stood in hallways talking in the lowered voices of people who have received large amounts of information and are still processing it. The engineering staff on the main floor moved through their routines with a slightly distracted quality. The consultant team, Crane's people, had completed their breakdown of equipment and were loading cases near the east entrance, their departure having been accelerated by the morning's events and the understanding that their services were no longer needed. Crane himself was standing near the entrance when Mason passed. He looked at Mason with an expression that contained several things at once, none of them simple, all of them earned. "Read," he said. Mason stopped. Crane looked like he was deciding something. He was a man who had built a professional identity on being the expert in the room, which meant that the particular experience of the past week, of having been the expert in the room and having missed what a maintenance worker found, was not something that had settled easily. Mason could see that. It wasn't comfortable to watch. "The fault signature analysis you presented at the terminal," Crane said. "The delta timing between sensor deviation and shutdown command, it was a correct read. I should have caught it." "The data presentation made it easy to miss," Mason said. "Everything was being displayed in isolation. When you're looking at individual fault events rather than overlaying the timing sequences, the pattern isn't obvious." "I know why I missed it," Crane said. "I'm not looking for an explanation that makes it easier." He looked at Mason with something that was not comfortable but was honest. Good work. He picked up his equipment case and walked out, and that was that. It wasn't a grand moment. It was just a man saying a thing that was true and difficult and walking away, which was usually how those moments actually went. Evelyn found Mason in the hangar at 5:30. The main floor was quieter than he'd ever seen it at this hour. The day shift was winding down, the equipment rigs were gone, and the Apex X900 sat in the center of the space in the reduced evening lighting with the particular stillness of a machine that has done its job and is at rest. She walked up beside him, and they both stood looking at the aircraft for a moment without saying anything, which felt appropriate. The Meridian Group called at 2 o'clock, she said finally. They're moving forward with the contract. Mason nodded. Full 7-year agreement, $1.2 billion. She said the number without particular excitement, which was the right register for it. It was relief, not triumph. There was a difference. Their technical team was satisfied with the demonstration performance. The fault history was disclosed as part of the presentation, along with the fact that it had been determined to be the result of deliberate interference rather than a design or manufacturing deficiency. They found that clarifying, apparently. Good, Mason said. Adrian is in federal custody, Evelyn said. The transmitter, the financial records, the access logs, the camera footage. Carver told me this afternoon that the evidentiary picture is, her word was comprehensive. The short position accounts have been frozen. It'll take time to work through the legal process, but the investigators seem confident about where it ends. Mason had known all of this was coming, had known it since the morning on the roof, but hearing it stated plainly still did something. Not satisfaction exactly, more like the closing of a pressure that had been building for days and had finally found an exit. I owe you an apology, Evelyn said. He looked at her. You don't. I suspended you based on fabricated evidence, and I did it because the board pressured me and because I made a calculation about optics. She said it without softening it. I knew you hadn't done what the transfer record suggested. I knew it, and I authorized the suspension anyway because it was operationally convenient. That's not nothing. It was the right call, Mason said. It worked. It worked because you told me to do it. That's different from it being right. She looked at him with the direct quality that he'd identified early on as one of her distinguishing features. She didn't manage conversations toward comfortable outcomes. She let them land where they needed to. I've been running this company for 20 years. I'm good at building systems, finding capital, managing programs. I am not apparently very good at paying attention to the people who are inside those systems doing the actual work. Mason thought about Dolores Vance flagging an access irregularity and getting a fast clearance that nobody followed up on. He thought about his own 3 years of watching fault patterns and keeping his mouth shut because he'd learned that the maintenance worker's observation was not the observation the room was interested in. He thought about the 11 years before Hartwell and the mistake he'd made once by saying a name too soon and what that had cost him, and how those costs had eventually deposited him here, in this hangar, in this conversation. It's not a personal failing, he said. It's structural. When someone's title tells you how much weight to give their information, you stop actually evaluating the information. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. That's exactly what it is. She looked at the aircraft. I want to offer you a position, a real one, not as a courtesy, not as compensation for what happened this week. Because this company needs someone in a role that doesn't currently exist here, and you're the person I want in it. What role? Director of Reliability and Technical Safety, independent reporting line to the board, authority to flag any safety or reliability concern at any level of the organization, with a mandatory review process that doesn't route through operations or any single administrative channel. She paused. The investigation identified that as a systemic failure. Adrian was able to clear safety flags because all safety reporting ran through his office. That changes. Mason looked at the aircraft for a moment, at the intake mouth of the right engine, which had been silent for 18 days and had run clean all morning, at the cowling that bore the wear marks of being opened and closed too many times by people who were looking at the wrong thing. I'll take it, he said, under one condition. Evelyn waited. The maintenance and ground crew teams get a formal reporting channel that doesn't depend on supervisory approval, Mason said. If someone on the floor sees something, anything, a flag, an anomaly, a pattern that doesn't fit, they can report it directly into the safety review system without it being filtered by anyone above them in the operational chain, anonymous if they want it to be. Done, Evelyn said. And the technical inspection process gets a secondary sign-off requirement. No single technician closes out a critical system inspection without a second independent verification. The ECM bracket closeout that Dolores flagged, that gets a second set of eyes from here forward. Any bracket, any junction, any connection point in a safety-critical system. Also done. Evelyn looked at him. Is there a third condition? Mason thought about it. No, he said. That's enough for now. She put out her hand. He shook it, and that was the agreement. Not a ceremony, just two people in a hangar deciding to do something differently than it had been done before. The weeks that followed were not easy in the way that things are not easy when the visible crisis has passed, but the structural damage it revealed still needs to be addressed. Hartwell went through an internal audit process that took 6 weeks and identified 11 additional system vulnerabilities in the reporting and oversight architecture that had allowed the fraud to run for 22 months undetected. 3 senior operational staff members resigned during the process, not because they were implicated in Adrian's scheme, but because the audit exposed long-standing procedural shortcuts that became professionally untenable once they were documented. Mason spent most of those weeks in meetings, which was not his natural environment, but which he navigated with the patience of someone who had learned that the work of changing a system was different from the work of understanding one. Understanding was what he'd always been good at. The quiet attention, the physical examination, the patient observation of patterns until they revealed themselves. Changing required something else. It required convincing people who had done things a particular way for a long time that doing them differently was worth the friction. Connor Hayes became his primary ally in that effort, which Mason had not entirely anticipated but should have. Hayes had the organizational standing that Mason didn't yet have, the relationships with the engineering staff, the credibility of someone who had been wrong in a specific and visible way, and had processed that experience honestly rather than defensively. He brought Mason into the engineering team's working sessions, vouched for the new inspection protocols when the floor supervisors pushed back, and generally functioned as the person who translated what Mason was trying to do into language the existing structure could receive. You know what you're actually good at, Hayes told him one afternoon, after a particularly grinding meeting with the program management team about implementing the secondary sign-off requirement, is the thing itself. The machine. You're not good at rooms full of people arguing about process. I know, Mason said. That's not a criticism. I'm saying you need to let me handle the rooms and you handle the machines. Is that what we're doing? That's what we've been doing for 3 weeks. I just thought you should know it was intentional on my part. Mason looked at him. That's a very generous division of labor that happens to give you the meetings. Yes, Hayes said without any apparent guilt about this. It does. You're welcome. There were moments in those weeks when Mason thought about what the situation had cost, not just professionally, but in the more personal accounting that happens in the quieter hours. The 2.5 years since his wife had died had been years of reduction, of making himself smaller, more peripheral, less present in his own life than he'd been before. The night shift had suited that. The maintenance work had suited it. The invisibility of a role where your name wasn't on anything important had suited it, because the alternative, being visible, being heard, being the person in the room whose read on a situation was the one that mattered, came with a weight he hadn't been sure he still wanted to carry. He'd been wrong about that, or not entirely right, which was different. The weight was real. It was also, it turned out, something he was built for carrying, and there was a particular loneliness in not carrying the thing you were built to carry. He'd been living that loneliness for 2 years without a name for it, and it had taken a small polymer washer and 18 days of a broken aircraft to remind him what the alternative felt like. He didn't romanticize this conclusion. It wasn't a transformation. It wasn't a man reborn through adversity. It was just a man who had been standing in the wrong place for a while and had finally moved. 4 months after the demonstration, the Apex X900 program reached its first major production milestone, the completion of the certification flight test series required for regulatory approval. Mason was in the observation area when the final test flight landed, not because anyone had asked him to be there, but because he'd been tracking the flight test schedule the way he tracked everything, and it seemed like the right place to be. Dolores Vance was there too, which he hadn't expected. She was standing about 10 feet from him with a coffee cup and a look of careful attention, watching the aircraft taxi in from the runway. When she noticed Mason, she gave him a short nod. Not warm exactly, but genuine. The nod of someone who felt their account had been settled. Jackson Cole attended the post-flight briefing and spent most of it asking questions about the data recording systems that nobody else in the room found particularly interesting, but which Mason thought showed exactly the right kind of attention to the parts of a situation that weren't visible until they mattered. Grace Turner sent a text message at 2 in the afternoon. Final audit report filed today. Clean. Thought you'd want to know. He saved the message without responding, which she probably understood. The legal process around Adrian Blake moved at the pace legal processes moved at, which was slowly and without drama. The investigators had described the evidentiary picture as comprehensive, and that characterization held, by the time the formal charges were filed, the documentation was thorough enough that the proceedings felt almost anticlimactic in contrast to the week that had generated them. $9 million in anticipated profit from a short position, $4.2 million in fraudulent vendor payments, 2 years of planning, a small polymer washer and a wireless signal injector, and a cloned badge record and a camera footage gap that had been logged as a system maintenance window. The things people build when they decide that the work of others is acceptable collateral. The infrastructure of that decision, laid out in transaction records and access logs, was not dramatic. It was just the evidence of a particular kind of coldness, patient and meticulous and utterly indifferent to what it was dismantling, until the moment it wasn't indifferent anymore, because the thing it was trying to dismantle had survived. It was Hayes who suggested the display case. He brought it up at a reliability program meeting 6 months after the demonstration, almost offhandedly. They had been discussing the new inspector training curriculum, specifically the section on fault pattern recognition, and Hayes said, "We should have the washer in the training room, not as a trophy, just as a reference point. Something people can look at while they're learning about what a planted fault looks like versus a genuine one." The room's reaction was divided in the way that rooms are divided when someone says something that sounds like it might be either profound or unnecessarily theatrical, and people aren't sure which yet. Evelyn, who attended the reliability meetings now on a rotating basis, looked at Mason. "What do you think?" she asked. Mason thought about the washer. He thought about it sitting in the evidence bag on Evelyn's desk, looking absurd and small. He thought about Dolores Vance and her access irregularity flag, and the fast clearance that closed it out, and the 14 years she'd spent at Hartwell noticing things and filing reports and not being confident that they were landing anywhere. He thought about his own 3 years of watching fault patterns from the periphery of a hangar floor and calculating whether his observation was worth the friction of offering it. "Put it in a case," he said, "in the main training room. Label it with what it is, what it did, how long it took to find it, and how it was found." He paused. "Not as a warning, as a reminder of what happens when the smallest thing gets missed, and what happens when someone finally pays attention to it." The case was installed the following week. Simple glass, clean label, mounted on the wall at the entrance to the main technical training room where every new certification candidate and every incoming inspection technician would see it when they walked in. The washer inside was the actual washer, not a replica, not a manufactured reference sample, the actual component that had been removed from the ECM bracket on the 21st morning of an 18-day problem. Mason walked past it most mornings without stopping. It wasn't a monument, and he didn't treat it like one. It was a physical object that had once been in the wrong place and had now found a more useful location, which was about as much significance as a small polymer disc could reasonably be asked to carry. But there were mornings, not every morning, just some, when he would stop for a moment and look at it. Not because it reminded him of what he'd done, because it reminded him of what almost wasn't done, of how close the whole thing had come to going the other way, of how long it had been sitting there, doing its damage, while rooms full of qualified people examined everything around it and not it. He thought about the maintenance workers who had filed reports that got cleared without follow-up. About Dolores, who had moved on because there was a proper sign-off. About the 6-hour camera gap that Jackson had found and reported and had closed out as routine. About all the ways a system can be telling you something is wrong while the people inside it are too busy looking at the official version to hear it. The thing about attention, real attention, the kind that costs something, is that it doesn't come from authority or credentials or the right job title. It comes from being present enough and humble enough and honest enough to look at the thing itself rather than the report about the thing. Mason had spent 11 years being credentialed and employed in exactly the right roles, and he'd been good at it, and then he'd lost it, and the 2 years he'd spent losing it had taught him something that the 11 years of having it hadn't, that the credential was never what made the observation possible. The observation was always what made the credential worth anything. He thought about his wife sometimes, in those morning moments, about what she'd said about rooms, about how his inability to read a room made him the only person sometimes willing to say the thing the room needed to hear. He thought she would have found this entire situation somewhat characteristic of him. The part where he stood in the background watching for weeks and then walked up to a CEO and said, "Give me 5 minutes, all of it characteristic." She would have told him he should have said something sooner. She would have been right. He was working on that. Not perfectly, not in any clean narrative arc of personal growth. Just incrementally, the way you work on the things you know are true about yourself and can't entirely fix. He said things sooner now. He sat in the rooms that Hayes managed, and he made himself say what he saw, even when the room's reaction told him it wasn't what the room wanted to hear. He got it wrong sometimes. He was too blunt or too technical or too impatient with process when the process felt like it was protecting its own existence rather than protecting the work. He was imperfect in the role, which was fine. Imperfect was what the role was built for. The whole point of the independent safety function was that it wasn't supposed to be comfortable, wasn't supposed to integrate smoothly, wasn't supposed to stop asking questions just because the questions created friction. The friction was the point. On the day the Meridian contract formally executed, 9 months after the demonstration, after the certification tests and the regulatory reviews and the legal and commercial processes that turned an agreement in principle into a signed document, Evelyn called a brief all-hands meeting in the main hangar. The aircraft was there, positioned at the center of the floor as it had been on that first morning when Mason had stood at the tool bench and watched it and felt the theory forming. Evelyn stood in front of the aircraft and spoke for about 8 minutes, which was shorter than people expected and better for it. She talked about the program, about the team, about what the contract represented for the company's trajectory. She said the right things about resilience and institutional strength, and she meant them, but Mason could hear the place where the speech was edited, the place where the full version would have said more, would have named the specific failure that nearly ended it, would have articulated exactly what it cost and what it revealed about who the company had been and who it was trying to become. She didn't say those things to the assembled staff. She'd said them in smaller rooms, to smaller groups, in the months since. The process of institutional honesty was slower and less cinematic than a speech, and it happened in increments rather than declarations. What she did say, near the end, was this: the lesson this program taught us, the one I want to carry forward, is that the most important information we will ever have about this company's systems and this company's aircraft will come from the people who are closest to the work. Not closest to the decisions about the work. Closest to the work itself. And our job, all of our jobs, is to make sure that information has somewhere to go when it matters. Mason was standing at the back of the group, near the wall where he usually stood. He heard the sentence and recognized it, and did not feel particularly moved by it in the way that sentences are supposed to move people when they're delivered as conclusions. He felt instead something quieter and less definable. The recognition of a true thing being said in a room where it needed to be said by someone who had learned it the hard way and was trying to pass it on, which was the only way true things ever really traveled. After the meeting, people went back to work. The hangar filled again with the sounds of a functioning operation, tools and equipment and conversation and the distant, intermittent sound of an aircraft engine being tested somewhere on the south side of the facility. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of people doing the thing they came here to do. Mason stopped at the training room on his way back to his office. He looked at the case on the wall. The washer inside, small and off-white, sitting in its labeled mount. Someone had placed a sticky note on the glass at some point in the past week. Handwritten, in the slightly cramped script of someone who'd written it quickly. It said, "I found something similar on Unit 3 last Thursday. Filed a report. Got a call back in 2 hours. Thanks." It was unsigned. Mason looked at the note for a moment. Then he continued down the hallway toward his office, where there was work waiting and more work after that, and the particular kind of ongoing attention that the job required. Not dramatic, not conclusive, just present. Just looking at the thing itself, every day, for as long as it took. That was all it had ever been. That was enough.